Hey, everybody, this is Dan Trottenchek. I'm the Executive Vice President with the North American Retail Hardware Association, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to your group once again. Today, we're going to be talking about instant disruption, COVID 19, and its impact on retail. So, why don't we go ahead and get started?
But what we're going to talk about today is the fact that since the beginning of this year, and as I said to begin with, since I talked to you guys last time, there has been this instant disruption to all of our lives. And this instant disruption has really probably had an outsized effect on the home improvement industry, but also on this kind of consumer retailer relationship. So we want to talk about this instant disruption that COVID-19 has caused and its impact on real. If I haven't said so yet, I'm Dan Trottenchek. I'm the Executive Vice President with the North American Hardware Association. And as always, I appreciate the opportunity to get in front of, or even if it's virtually in front of, groups like this and discuss things that are going on, because it's our mission at NRHA to help hardware stores, home centers, and lumber yards, regardless of their wholesale affiliation, become better and more profitable. And we think by us being able to kind of take a step back, you guys are in those kind of weeds every day, dealing with consumers and so on. It's a little bit easier for us to reach out, gather research that we see from other organizations, do research ourselves, talk to retail groups, and bring that kind of information back to you. So what exactly are we going to talk about here today? The first thing we're going to really touch on is kind of those early days and what we've seen develop over the last 6 months. What was the channel's reaction to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, and what that meant for retail operations and just the day-to-day how you guys go about doing your work. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to switch over and talk about some of the kind of shorter and longer term potential impacts that COVID will have specifically to the home improvement channel. Because as I said, there's almost been an outsized impact of COVID on home improvement. And we'll talk about why that is here in a second. And lastly, I really want to spend some time focusing on how COVID and the pandemic and just all of our behavior has really changed, and how those changes in behavior have a distinct impact on consumers and the way they interact with their sources of supply. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about how the channel initially reacted. While I'm sure for all of you guys, it seems like we've been dealing with COVID for years, it's amazing to think that it's only been 8 or 9 months that we've been having to deal with this. And I've said it multiple times recently, but I think that 2 things are important that I want to bring up. One is I have been so impressed as an outside observer looking at how specifically independent retailers in our channel have been able to turn on a dime and really meet those changing consumer needs and change your entire operational structure in so many ways to really respond to the things that are at hand. And I want to start out also mentioning this, is that early on, and if you've listened to my podcast or read my column in the magazine, you may have heard me bring this up before, but within the first weeks of the pandemic, I was on a conference call with some retailers, and one of the retailers that we're on the call with expressed this, and it really stuck with me, and that's why I've mentioned it so many times. He said at that point, he said, I really feel like as home improvement retailers, we are privileged right now. We are privileged to be able to be considered essential and to be able to have our stores open, and we just can't lose sight of that, because he was talking about his friends that ran local restaurants, his friends that ran local other businesses that really saw their operations just torn apart and having to shut down and having to lay off people. And he said, you know, as difficult as it gets, and as much as we might complain about the challenges of running our operations under these conditions, we are truly privileged that we are even able to operate, and privileged that we're able to service our communities. So I thought that was a great way to kind of start out our discussion. And those aren't my words, those were a retailer's words. uh, again, like I said, someone once said, COVID years are like dog years. It's like, 1 year under COVID seems like it's 7 years. So when you really think about it, this pandemic really truly emerged in early March. In early March, I was still flying places and going to shows and taking meetings. And by mid-March, the world had changed. The first sign that I think really drove it home for me was when some of the wholesale markets began to cancel in early and mid-March. And that really drove it home that this is something that's going to be different from anything we've seen before. And these kind of shutdowns of the markets were shortly followed by entire communities shutting down. And it happened realistically in a period of a couple weeks. It's amazing to think, but I think this is worth pointing out, it was March 16th that the North American Retail Hardware Association, we got a call from one of the heads of a distribution company who said, can you help us do something to make sure that home improvement stores are considered essential business providers in their community? And our CEO said, Dan, we need to get on this. And it was really within a couple days that we were able to draft a letter stating the case for why local home improvement organizations should be considered essential. And amazingly, we got the support from every single leader at every single wholesale group, buying group, distribution company, co-op in the United States and Canada said, what do you need? We're going to get behind you on this. What do you need from us? And once we had this letter and we had all the signatures on it, we sent it off to every governor of every state in the United States, to Puerto Rico, to Canadian provinces, to local governments, to the Vice President of the United States office. And within very short order, it was pretty widely, every community in the US and mostly in Canada had deemed home improvement retailers essential. Certainly we're not taking credit for that, but I thought I wanted to point it out because one of the biggest changes that I thought occurred right away was it was really a momentous time because the entire industry came together. Everybody put down their flags and said, this is important, we need to do this. And so when I'm talking about kind of disruptions brought about by COVID, I think that was really the first sign of, yeah, this is a big disruptor, but it can also be a disruptor in a very positive way because it was a very positive impact that seeing how when the industry comes together, how much stronger we are and how much we can get done. And as I said, happy to report that as communities began to issue stay-at-home orders pretty widely across all the areas we cover, home improvement was considered essential. So that out of the way, let's talk about kind of this economic impact. And I probably don't need to tell you guys this because you're living it, but I think it's good to give you a sense of what's going on in the market as a whole. Since mid-March, not that we don't always do this, but since mid-March, NRHA and all of our kind of different arms outreaching, we've been staying in very regular contact weekly with large retail groups, really kind of running the gamut across the country and Canada, helping keep them informed about what's going on with COVID, but sharing insights into what they're seeing in their communities and in their businesses. So a lot of the information we're going to share comes from kind of the anecdotal feedback that we get just being in contact with those retailers. But we've also done some of our own research, and I'm going to share some research from some of our organizations in the industry that we really partner with and rely on for kind of a broader picture of what's happening. And again, I just caution at this point to say there is any kind of status quo. I mean, we have never seen anything like this. So the concept of status quo is really day by day and less so, periods of months and so on, because things are just changing so rapidly. But what have we seen? Just overall kind of economically in the industry, retailers have been reporting record strong sales in home improvement. And if you follow kind of retail in general, this has been a bit of an anomaly. Home improvement is really leading the way amongst all types of retailers. And we're going to get into some of the reasons for that. But when we first did a study of retailers back in I believe it was late April, early May, we were saying that independent home improvement retailers were seeing on average sales increases year to year of about 17, 18%. Well, now, here we are 3 months beyond that, and we're seeing sales in the up year over year in the 22-23% range. So it's really kind of holding the kind of increases that we've really seen since the beginning of the pandemic. Another thing that I'm going to talk about here in a second, and that I think that we were unsure about, is the first 3 months of this. The retailers I was talking to, a lot of them were very concerned, saying, yeah, we're getting these sales now, but I think Q3 and Q4, these sales are just going to drop off. So I'm concerned. I'm going to be very conservative, and so on and so forth. And we just haven't seen those kind of drop-offs. And a lot of those same retailers that I've talked to are now saying, well, I think we're budgeting pretty strong for the balance of the year, and we're actually looking at 2021 and thinking that we're going to retain some of this growth that we've seen. So let's talk about initially, and what are the reasons, what are the factors driving these increases that we're seeing, and how COVID kind of figures into that mix. Originally, these sales increases we began seeing fell into three distinct buckets of types of sales. One of them were sales that were being generated by this kind of work from home concept. By April, most companies, I know NRHA, it was right around mid-March that we went into a work from home protocol that we're still in, but a lot of companies began going to work from home. So there were a lot of sales in home improvement stores originally tied to this. People were getting into home organization. They were painting rooms. You got to fix that bedroom up into a home office. They were buying, electrical supplies and AV equipment to allow them to work from home. So a lot of that kind of sales lift was driven by this whole new work from home thing. The second bucket of sales that we saw that was originally kind of driving this sales list was this concept of project catch-up. I'm home from work. Maybe I'm working from home, or maybe I've just been furloughed, but I'm staring at the four walls of my house and I have a little bit more time now. So I want to catch up on these kind of pent-up projects. It also kind of happened to coincide, the onset of the pandemic coincided with us moving out of the winter months. So it's a typical spring project time anyway, but a lot of that money was being spent on, man, I just can't stand staring at our dining room and the paint is dingy and we got to fix it. Let's go ahead and paint it. We have the time now. And then lastly, of course, initially there was a boost in what we would call this COVID-related category of products, which were home cleaning supplies, PPE supplies, tarps, storage, a lot of that stuff that was directly related to, I want to make sure my environment is safe, clean, air purifiers, all that kind of thing that was related to. So those were kind of the initial buckets that we saw that were driving those big initial sales lifts out of COVID. And a little bit, I'm going to talk about kind of how that's changed a little bit. But right now, as we look at this anecdotal feedback we get, but we also look at more empirical evidence from research that we're seeing out there, we do not see this imminent slowdown in home improvement sales anytime in the year, in the upcoming possibly year. Some people are even seeing it extend to 2 years. Now, there may be some areas on remodeling activity that might see some slowdown, but right now, where we sit right now, and remember I said, status quo is hard to predict because everything's so fluid. Right now, we're really not seeing that kind of slowdown coming anytime, certainly for the balance of 2020 and under most counts, not through the majority of 2021. I'm going to refer to some numbers now that are pretty interesting, and these numbers come from a good industry friend of NRHA's, the folks over at the Farnsworth Group and the Home Improvement Research Institute. Farnsworth is based here in Indianapolis, where NRHA is based, and they're a market research firm that really focuses on the home improvement industry. And just like NRHA tried to react early on in this crisis, so did Farnsworth. And what their comfort zone is, and their specialty is obviously collecting data and research. So they began doing something called their COVID-19 Tracker Index. And I have a link to that later in this address because it's free. You could just go to their website, sign up to it, and you get these reports. And what they started doing was reaching out to homeowners and also to contractors and remodelers to ask them, What are you doing? What are you spending on home improvement? What's causing you to spend that, and so on. And it's been a really interesting process to watch. So what we learned early on from this information that Farnsworth had come up with, their first reports began coming out in early April. So back on April 8th, they found that 63% of the homeowners they had talked to indicated that they had started a new home improvement project within the last 2 weeks. So a lot of that was the stuff I just talked about, all those reasons that we just shared about why people were engaging projects. But what's interesting is on one of their more recent tracker index studies that came out in early July, 70% of homeowners indicated that they had started a new home improvement project in the last 2 weeks. So if anything, the incidence of homeowners engaging in home improvement products is roughly holding steady, if not slightly increasing as the months have passed. Now, that's not all due to COVID. Obviously, we're in this right now, as we're recording this, we're in the end of the summer months. So these are high home improvement activity as well. But take a look at some of these other slides. Early on, back in April, 86% of the homeowners they talked to said that the onset of COVID had caused them to start or had an impact on them starting these projects in some way. Now, the number's gone down slightly, but it's really a negligible decline. 82% of homeowners say, yes, COVID is one of the factors that's influencing me to start these projects I'm working on. So while a lot of it, some of that lift could be attributed to just being in the regular kind of time to work on projects, homeowners are telling the Farnsworth Group that COVID is having an impact on that. Early on, back in late March, 21% of the homeowners they talked to said that they had not planned to start any of these projects prior to COVID. And now 33% say that they had not planned to start these projects prior to COVID. So again, strong empirical evidence here suggesting that COVID is still playing a positive role in homeowners engaging in home improvement activity. 36% said, this is again back in April, 36% of homeowners said they are starting these projects as a direct result of COVID, and now 29% are. So again, it's down 7% as a direct result of COVID, but it's still, again, I think it underscores the fact that COVID is still playing a pretty significant role in homeowners engaging in home improvement activity. So what are the categories that are kind of emerging as the strongest categories that we've seen over the last 6 months? Well, again, a lot of it is still being reflected in those kind of buckets that we talked about earlier: paint, cleaning supplies, storage, PPE, and really over the last 3 months, lawn and garden and lawn maintenance has really emerged strong. And a lot of that is, yes, it's the season for lawn maintenance. But the other thing is people are tired of being in their house and getting out in the sunshine and working on their lawn. They're probably even more apt to do that right now than they ever have been in recent years. So Farnsworth also asks, what are the projects that you're likely to start in the next 2 weeks? And still, some of the things we just talked about: painting a room, landscaping and lawn maintenance, and general home maintenance. We're not seeing some of these big remodeling projects taking center stage, but this just kind of basic do-it-yourself stuff is really prominent right now, and it doesn't show any signs of slowing. And again, here it is. If you're interested in signing up for the COVID Tracker weekly updates, you can go to thefarnsworthgroup.com/COVID or go to www.heary.org and sign up for that. So that's what we've seen to this point in terms of COVID's economic impact on the industry. The industry is seeing record increases in sales. But I think what may be more important, kind of in the long-term scheme of things, is how this whole pandemic has impacted consumers and really created ripples of change that are going to persist long after the virus has subsided. Another organization that I referred to that are good friends of ours and that focus on the home improvement industry is a group called Consumer Specialists. And the gentleman who runs Consumer Specialists is a fellow by the name of Fred Miller. And Fred is a good industry friend of mine personally, but has been around the industry as long, if not longer, than I have. And his entire career has really been focused on research in the industry. And he focuses a lot on the consumer side and a lot on that kind of consumer packaged goods side. And they just recently did a study through Consumer Specialists where they looked at the impact of COVID on home improvement consumer attitudes. And one of the things that really struck me when they released this study was a quote that was included from Fred Miller. Now, like I said, Fred has been watching this industry for a long time. Definitely, again, I've been in the industry 25 years. He's probably been in it longer than that. But one of the quotes that Fred had in that discussion really struck me. He said, in terms of consumer attitudes and behavior, there has never been a single force that has so significantly shaped the home improvement market as COVID has. And I got to tell you, I'm tending to agree with him. And I'm not just talking about some of the hard home improvement behaviors that we're going to share here in a second, but also just the thoughts about how consumers behave and how they go about buying, researching products. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But let's share some of the things that the consumer specialist study revealed. One of the biggest things is echoing what we just talked about. They indicated that their research showed that consumers' renewed interest in investing in their homes does not look like it's going to subside anytime soon. They said they feel that it's going to at least last into the next year and possibly beyond that. What are some of the things that are prolonging that trend? Well, again, people are at home more than ever. Not only they're at home, so they're staring at those projects that they want to complete, but they also, by the nature of what we're doing with work from home or some of the challenges with people being furloughed or people not taking vacations and you're home every weekend, you're not going places, is that you have more time than ever before. The other second thing is there are certainly fewer entertainment options. People aren't buying season tickets to sporting events. People aren't going on cruises. They're not going on vacations. And so they look at when that is something that we haven't really ever seen to this magnitude. The closest thing I could really equate it to would be the last recession. And that was everything was tied back to one issue, and that was concern over jobs and concern over disposable income. Now, those other options just are not available to you. You can't go to the theater. You can't go to the movies. You can't really go dine out as you could in the past. And so those fewer entertainment options, as consumers have disposable incomes, with fewer options, they're more apt to spend it on investing in projects around their home. The last element that we tend to see during any times of uncertainty, but I think it's very punctuated right now, is this nesting concept. And I put in here nesting in place because kind of like the shelter in place, is that during times of trouble, consumers, all of us, tend to say, I want to feather my nest. I want to build the area that's safe to me, and I want to invest in safe things. And what's safer than your home? And so we're seeing that, but we're seeing that multiplied to the extent that we really haven't seen before. Again, more specifically, some of the things that came through in the consumer specialist report was that project intent, the number of consumers saying that they're likely to engage in a home improvement project, is up over where it was in this time last year, and up significantly. And that intent stretches out through to next year. They ask, how likely are you to engage in project next few weeks, next few months, next 6 months, next 12 months? And all of those show an increase over last year. So consumers don't show any sign of slowing investing in their homes, at least over the next 12-month period. What they're telling consumer specialists, again, echoes what we've already talked about. They're investing in kitchens, they're investing in landscaping, they're investing in bathrooms, but a lot of them plan to do these projects themselves. So they're not necessarily tackling those big projects, but those are the areas of the home that they're focusing on. Something else that came through in some of the results that we saw from this study was that today's consumers, and again, this shouldn't come as a shock because it's really kind of seems to be logical. Today's consumers are relying much less on face-to-face interactions for their project inspiration and guidance, really more so than they ever have. And that's something as independent retailers you certainly need to be aware of is, again, if there are things that independent retailers really hang their hats on, it's service and convenience. And service and convenience right now are probably two of the biggest areas that are being impacted in the way of consumer behavior. This first one we're going to talk about is service, and that service being, when I get someone in front of me in the store, I can inspire them to create things, I can inspire them to do projects, and I can walk them through that project. Well, what consumer specialist research shows us is that fewer face-to-face interactions are taking place, and consumers are saying they're less likely to have those face-to-face interactions. In fact, they asked consumers where they seek insights and inspiration for their home improvement projects. And year over year, 12.2% more of the consumers they talked to said they are turning to the internet and online as a source for project information. The other place that's seen a similar increase is they're turning to professionals and contractors as a source for information on home improvement. In fact, the only areas when they asked in that study of where you're turning for insights and inspiration on your projects, the only areas to really see declines were in-store personnel and in-store displays. So what does that tell us? Logically, consumers are going less frequently into stores, and they're beginning their search for information and projects and guidance online and by talking to tradesmen and professionals. So again, this should be something you note as an independent retailer. If you're not playing in that sphere, and if you're counting on your service reverberating when you have those face-to-face interactions, that's something that COVID has really hastened into changing. And I'm going to say this now because it really applies to everything we talk about from this point on, is that these behaviors aren't likely to change when COVID goes away. In a recent column in the magazine, I discussed, my wife's behaviors. And prior to COVID, she had never used a grocery delivery service. We had very rarely used meal delivery services beyond ordering a pizza. Now, my wife orders our groceries online every week, and she either pulls into the store to the curbside pickup and gets them put in the trunk, or she has them delivered to our door. And her sentiment has been, I never did this because I never thought about it. COVID caused me to think about it, but I think we're just going to keep doing this. And I could say the same for me is I had probably been on 2 or 3 Zoom meetings prior to COVID. Now I'm on 2 or 3 a day, and my behavior is not going to change once everybody's back in the office space. Sure, I'll take more face-to-face meetings, but Zoom is going to be a big part of that process moving forward, just like grocery delivery is going to be a big part of that process for my wife. So if you're out there saying, well, that's fine right now, consumers are going online to research projects, blah, blah, blah. As soon as COVID's over, they're going to start coming back in. I wouldn't rely on that. One thing that consumer specialist asks is, where do you turn for your products to complete your projects? And while the leader of all the resources was the local stores, and when I say local here, that's just talking about stores that are local in their area. So that also, for reference on this, would include big boxes. They're not talking about locally owned specifically, but locally owned stores are still the leading option consumers mention. But it's also important to know that number is significantly down year over year. So in this year's study, 59% of the consumers said the local store is where I will turn for my products, for my home improvement projects. Last year in 2019, 66% of those consumers said the local store was likely to lead. So a 7% decline in just a 1-year period. From a research standpoint, that is incredibly significant. And obviously, the change to this control has been the onset of COVID and that kind of pandemic shopping behavior. As I said, consumers are also looking for new sources for insights and inspiration for their home improvement projects. It's just interesting to point out that a lot of them are saying, if I'm going to hire a contractor, I'm just going to rely on them choosing where to get the products. And as we said, local stores still being the top option, but there was still about a 6% decline. The good news, though, to come out of this is we've been at NRHA trying to quantify this concept that has been a hypothesis, and we've felt this anecdotally, is that independently owned businesses, independent home improvement retailers have gained market share during the COVID months. And as we're trying to gather that information, and we'll share that as soon as we kind of can drive to it, but one of the things that supports that assertion was some of this data that came out of the consumer specialist study. Because what we saw was while local stores had declined overall as a means to get your products, when we broke that down to talking about the different types of local stores, hardware stores and lumber yards and paint stores, which I don't have on here, but all three of those, which again, now we're really talking about the independent businesses and excluding that home center segment, they saw pretty strong increases in the number of consumers say they were going to them. So of the people that said they were patronizing local stores, 41% in 2019 had said they were going to their local hardware store. Well, now in 2020, it's 48%. And you could see on the lumberyard side, it was 16% last year and 22% in 2020. So that would kind of underscore this, that there is a distinct opportunity right now for locally owned home improvement stores to continue capturing a greater share of market as a result of some of these changed shopping behaviors from COVID. What are the reasons behind that? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with, and certainly originally earlier on, had to do with I feel safer going to a local store. The local stores did a pretty darn good job of controlling people coming and going, of enforcing mask rules, of enforcing social distancing guidelines. And for the most part in big boxes, it was kind of the Wild West. It took them a while to figure it out and get systems rolled out. And I just think it was just that kind of mental barrier for customers and consumers saying, I just feel a little bit safer going to my local store. Now, again, the stories I told you about myself and my wife's behavior and consumer behavior in general, it's something that you guys, independent retailers, have said you want for a long time. We just want a shot at getting that business. Well, this change in consumer behavior because of the pandemic is giving you that shot. You are seeing more customers gravitating towards locally owned businesses right now than they are toward the big boxes. So it's your opportunity to make the most out of that. As we did with Farnsworth Group, if you're interested in the entire study from Consumer Specialists, just go to consumerspecialists.com and you can see how you can get the detail on this study. So let's talk, we've talked about some of the consumer changes and so on. Let's talk more about some of these long-term changes that we might be seeing in consumer behavior. The concept that COVID has reset consumer expectations. Again, consumers began thinking about a lot of things that they never thought about before as a result of COVID. A lot of those things were changes that I would say were gradually beginning, but COVID turned it up to 11 and really caused those changes to become more prominent and caused consumers to rethink things like convenience and service. So let's talk a little bit about that. One of the things that we feel are going to be lasting impacts of COVID, it has really reinforced independence among consumers. And what I mean by that is without the ability to have that face-to-face interaction, more consumers have become comfortable with finding information on their own and doing more research in front of actually making that product purchase and finding ways to kind of change the way they interact with retailers that really put them in the driver's seat. I want to do business the way I want to do it, and you're going to have to learn to adapt to me, not the other way around. Consumers also have become more accustomed to wanting what I say maximum impact with minimum contact. And that means I now expect retailers to offer me options for package pickup. I want options for having it delivered to my home. I want options. How do I get the same services that I could get before, but now with the minimum degree of contact? And I think we're also, and we just did touch on this by the kind of empirical evidence backing this up, we think that there is a resurgent opportunity for locally owned businesses. And that's being influenced not just by COVID, but a lot of things going on in our society as it relates to people rethinking the impact of how of where they spend their money and where that money goes. A lot of kind of the social changes that we're seeing that right now all play into that concept. Let's talk for a second about this concept of reinforced consumer independence. Consumers, again, have accepted that the concept there are going to be fewer face-to-face interactions and seeking that information. And again, as consumer specialists pointed out, more people are turning online to do it. So if you as a retailer are not playing in that arena, you really need to rethink if you are offering the same kind of service that today's customers demand. I think that I can't emphasize this enough, that the rapid changes in what consumers think of as service and what that service paradigm is, has to really change the way you independent retailers think about the concept of how you offer service. Because if you're not offering these things that the new consumer, whether it's from COVID, that has forced them into this behavior, or whether they've discovered these behaviors because of COVID, if you're not meeting those needs, they are going to gravitate toward retailers who do. You to focus on how can you deliver insights, inspiration, education to consumers outside of the in-store experience. It is really no longer an option. It is a must that consumers are demanding. So what are the ways you can do that? You could do it online. You could do it through your social media. You could host webinars or Zoom meetings where you're teaching customers about new products or how they can engage in projects. But you have to engage in all of those kind of resources that offer that same kind of service without customers ever having to set foot in the store. Let's talk for a second about this concept of maximum opportunities with minimum impact. Obviously, consumers still need to rely on you for traditional transactions. They have home improvement projects they want to engage in, have products they need to purchase. But also now, as I anecdotally, again, mentioned with some of my wife's consumer behaviors changing, so are your customers. And so you have to, and I'll give retailers a lot of credit for this. You have done a relatively good job to this point on the independent side, trying to respond to this during COVID, but you have to think about, what are my long-term plans? I can't stop things like curbside delivery or online ordering or just outright delivery once the pandemic goes away. So you have to figure out, how do I weave that into my long-term plan of action, because customers aren't just going to drop those demands once COVID goes away. Again, focusing on things like online ordering, phone ordering, curbside pickup, pre-order pickup are all options that have emerged. But once again, I think customers are willing to forgive some of the clumsiness of these kind of procedures when it was kind of a triage, when it's like, we got to get this figured out and have something available by next week. But they're going to be less forgiving as time moves on. So you really need to be in that planning mode right now of how we are going to make these not only available to customers, but how it's going to run smoothly. Another point about persistent behaviors is embracing this emergence of local. As I said before, we really truly believe that independents are gaining market share throughout this kind of COVID pandemic. And there are several factors that we talked about earlier that are driving this reemergence of local. But now is the time that you really need to understand and be able to capitalize on this opportunity you've been given of consumers now being more exposed to your operations. You need to understand and be more responsive to, how can we be a safer opportunity for customers to shop in? How can we be more flexible and less rigid around our rules for how you engage with us, so we can be more welcoming to you? How do we live up to this assumption that consumers have made that we're going to be more open to meeting their needs in a safe way than perhaps the big boxes are being? Because if they come to your store and it's a madhouse and everything just feels unsafe, they're going to quickly say, why did I come here when I could have just gone to the big box? And you're going to lose that opportunity. So you really need to think about the reasons they're coming to you now and make sure they find that experience what they get to the store. Also, it's a great time to focus on local messaging. There's been a lot of discussion throughout COVID of retailers pulling back on their advertising. And why, again, has kind of run the gamut from, I don't feel comfortable advertising products right now when everything's going on, or, we're still just trying to figure out how to service our regular customers. We want to be careful how much business we get in, or we've had some issues getting products, so we want to be careful around that. But there's a lot of reasons. But one area that I've heard a lot of retailers say, well, we might be advertising less in the traditional means, but what we've been doing is stepping up kind of our cause marketing, if you will. We're stepping up and reinforcing how we're keeping the community going and we're essential, and honoring your employees for being on those kind of front lines of essential workers, and talking about your involvement with the community, and kind of saying, we might get away a little bit from product advertising, but we really want to use that kind of investment to support our role in the local community, and some of these things that will underscore how important it is to patronize a local business. Another thing I want to touch on right now is, like I've said earlier, is that independent retailers in general, I've been so impressed with how you guys have reacted and turned on a dime to do things like create safe social distancing, ramp up services like curbside delivery or online ordering where it never existed before. And so I want to share some of that with you from some research we've done at NRHA. One of the things we found was when we reached out to independent home improvement retailers, and this, again, was back in April. 73% of the retailers at that time said they had added curbside pickup as a result of COVID-19. And the majority of those retailers said, we plan to continue offering this as a service beyond the pandemic. 53% of retailers have rethought their operating hours as a result of COVID, whether that meant originally narrowing the hours or now expanding the hours to be more accessible to customers, but really reconsidering how do we go about our regular day-to-day operations has been top of mind for retailers, and you've responded well to the needs of your customers. Lastly, we saw 49% of retailers say that we have seen an increase in online sales as a result of COVID. And the results, quite honestly, from some of the retailers we heard where they saw online sales up 100%, 200%, 300%. I know not everybody offers e-commerce, but again, it's one of these behaviors that COVID has underscored and put an exclamation mark behind. If you don't offer online ordering in some fashion, you're really going to be behind the curve, not only now, but certainly when we emerge from the pandemic. So what do we see as what lies ahead? I've given you a lot of hopefully useful information, or at least observations here, but there are still a lot of questions that nobody has an answer to. One thing that'll definitely be influenced is how long is this virus going to be with us? We hear companies today talking about not bringing employees back till like the Q3 of 2021. So if the virus persists that long, are we going to see a slide? Are things like the broader economic impact of what it does with unemployment, if people aren't coming back, or if entire industries like the restaurant and service industries are forever changed? Sooner or later, consumers are going to have to make a decision and say, I want to invest in my home, but I don't have the money to do it, or I don't have a job, so I can't do it. So those things could have an impact on the outlook, the longer term outlook of what could be a result of what we're seeing now. Again, the concept of disposable income. Right now, consumers have limited options, so that's created a greater pool of disposable income that can be focused on home improvement. But again, if jobs don't come back, if the economy suffers in any way, if the housing market weekends, which we haven't seen to this point, you could certainly see that have a negative impact on home improvement spending. How the supply chain holds up. It looks like after some bumps, we're getting back into shape. And I know everybody's working so hard all the way up and down the supply chain to get things going back to normal. But early on, even outside this industry, the much publicized things like the lack of the ability to get cleaning supplies or toilet paper, if this persists or if there's a second wave, could we see those same kind of challenges? And if we do, what kind of impact that will have? And lastly, in a positive sense, where I started the discussion was, I think, and hopefully a lasting impact out of this will be stronger cooperation, not just stronger cooperation amongst retailers for supporting each other, supporting other local businesses, supporting their communities, and vice versa, but for the entire industry, the entire home improvement industry, on the independent side, from the vendors to the distributors to the retailers, coming together to try and solve issues as a group. And that's what NRHA is all about. We say we're the Switzerland of the industry, and we sit kind of in between everything and try and help. And anything that will lead to a greater, stronger sense of cooperation amongst the channel partners, we see as a positive outcome. And we really think that this could be the impetus to get where we need to go. Everyone, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate not just you joining me for this virtual presentation, but everything you guys have done over the last 6 months to keep your communities going, to keep your workers working, and to keep people safe, and our homes up to date and in order, and everything that you have done during this period, not just for your employees and for your businesses, but your communities and the community of the industry overall. Thank you so much, and keep up the good work, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.